You are not risking enough, and society made you think that's wise. I think there is something wrong about the way we understand wisdom in our society today, because it seems to me that whenever we talk about being wise, we almost instinctively associate wisdom with safety, with avoiding unnecessary risks, with making sure that nothing goes terribly wrong, and with choosing the path that gives us the greatest degree of certainty. And I think there is some truth to this, because obviously a wise person should be able to recognize danger and should not expose himself to unnecessary suffering. But the more I think about it, the more I believe that this is only one part of wisdom. And that when we make safety the organizing principle of our decisions, we often forget to ask a much more important question. What are we giving up in order to be safe? I think I have personally been guilty of this for most of my life. Whenever I had an important decision to make, I would naturally try to weigh the alternative and choose the one where the risk was the smallest, or at least where the risk was something I could control to some reasonable degree. I thought, just like I imagine many of you are, that I should be aware of the risk involved in the decision I make and that I should try to minimize them, because this is what a wise person does. He looks at the situation, recognizes what could go wrong, and makes the decision that gives him the greatest chance of avoiding a negative outcome. And again, I don't think this is wrong. The problem appears when we quietly move from the idea of safety is one of the things that wisdom should take into account, to the idea that safety is what wisdom is ultimately trying to achieve. And I think there is a very simple concept from economics that can help us understand what is wrong with this way of thinking. I remember when I was in college, in one of my economic classes, we learned about something called opportunity cost. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the concept, but just to briefly explain, the opportunity cost is essentially the idea that whenever you choose one thing, there is a hidden cost associated with that choice, because by choosing one possibility, you are necessarily giving up all the other possibilities that were available to you. So if you have $10 and decide to buy a pizza, you now have a pizza. But you have also given up everything else you could have bought with those $10. The cost of the pizza isn't simply the $10 that you spent, it's also the opportunity to use those $10 for something else. And I think this idea applies much more broadly than economics. It applies to the way we make decisions about our entire lives. Because whenever we make a decision, we tend to look at what we are going to gain from it, and what we might lose if things go badly. But we don't always stop to think about what we are giving up by choosing that particular path. And this is exactly where I think our understanding of wisdom and risk becomes incomplete. If I choose the safest possible option in every situation, I'm certainly reducing the possibility of certain negative outcomes, but I'm also necessarily reducing the possibility of certain positive outcomes. And sometimes those positive outcomes are precisely the thing that makes a life worth living. This is something I started noticing when I looked at the way I've been taught to think about building a successful life. The conventional path is actually very reasonable. You learn, you go to school, you acquire skills, get a job, preferably one that pays well, and then you gradually build financial security and a stable life. There is nothing inherently wrong with this path, although some applications of it can be, but for the most part is a sensible thing a person can do. The problem is that the reasoning behind this path is almost entirely based on minimizing uncertainty. You are told to choose a career that is reliable, to avoid unnecessary financial risks, to make decisions that preserve your stability, and make sure that you have something to fall back on. The path has already been walked by millions of people before you, so you don't have to discover it yourself. You simply follow it. And because it has worked for so many people before you, it feels almost like a guarantee that it will work for you as well. And this is exactly what made it so convincing to me. The reasons are good, they are practical, it seems like basic common sense. But there is something hidden inside all of this advice. And that is that the entire system is optimized around safety. And safety is a very strange thing to optimize your entire life around, because safety is fundamentally defensive. It tells you what you should avoid, what you shouldn't lose, what you shouldn't risk, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what is worth pursuing. And I think this distinction becomes extremely important the moment you want something more than a simple life. Because perhaps you want to pursue a particular dream, or you have some kind of a calling that doesn't fit neatly into the conventional path, or create something that you believe could genuinely be valuable to other people. At this point, something interesting happens. The very thing that you are taught to avoid becomes necessary. You have to take a risk. And this is where I think the conventional wisdom often fails us, because we have been taught to think of risk as something that stands in the way of a good life, when in reality, certain risks are simply the price that has to be paid for the possibility of achieving something valuable. If you want to start a business, there is a possibility that it will fail. If you want to create something, there is a possibility that people will reject it. But the important question isn't whether the things are risky. Of course they are. The question is whether what you are pursuing is valuable enough to justify taking the risk. And that is a completely different way of thinking about wisdom. Instead of asking only, how can I make sure nothing goes wrong, you begin asking, what is worth risking to achieve the thing I am interested in? Because if you never ask the second question, you can end up making every decision correctly according to the logic of safety, while simultaneously moving further and further away from the life you actually wanted. And this is where the opportunity cost comes back into the picture. Imagine someone who spends his life choosing a safe career, the safe financial decision, the safe relationships, the safe routines, because he has been convinced that this is what a wise person does. Maybe he succeeds. Maybe he becomes financially comfortable and avoids many of the problems that other people experience. But what if he had the potential to build something extraordinary and never tried? What if he had a genuine calling that he ignored because following it would have introduced too many uncertainty? What if the cost of his safety was nothing that happened to him, but something that never happened because he never allowed it to happen? And I think this is one of the most difficult costs to recognize, because when you lose money, you know you lost money. When you fail at something, you know that you failed. But when you refuse to take a risk, there is often no immediate consequence that tells you what you have sacrificed. The opportunity simply disappears. There is no notification telling you that you just given up a possible future. You just continue living the life you already have. And perhaps 10 or 20 years later, you look back and realize that you are very successful at protecting yourself from failure, but you never gave yourself the opportunity to discover what you could have accomplished. And I think this is also why excessive safety can become a problem not only for the individual but for the society as a whole. Almost everything valuable that human beings have achieved required somebody at some point to accept a certain uncertainty. Art requires people to create something that might be rejected. Exploration requires people to leave what is familiar and enter what is unknown. Even moral courage sometimes requires a person to accept personal consequences, because doing what is right is more important than protecting oneself from those consequences. If everyone always optimized exclusively for safety, we would probably have a much more stable society, But in the same time, I'm not convinced that we will have a better one. Because progress itself requires a willingness to sacrifice some degree of certainty for the possibility of something better. And I think this is where we need to make an important distinction. I'm not saying that we should become reckless. Wisdom still requires prudence. It still requires you to understand consequences, to consider probabilities, and to recognize when a risk is simply foolish. But I think wisdom requires something more than risk avoidance. It requires us to understand what the risk is for. Because there are situations where the safest decision is clearly the wisest one. But there are also situations where the safest decision is actually the wrong one, precisely because what you are protecting is less valuable than what you are sacrificing. And I think this is the part of wisdom that we have forgotten. The goal isn't to maximize safety, even to minimize risk. The goal is to correctly understand what is valuable and then determine what you are willing to risk in order to obtain it. Because reality seems to be structured in such a way that anything genuinely valuable comes with some degree of uncertainty or sacrifice. If you want meaningful achievement, you have to accept the possibility of failure. If you want meaningful relationship, you have to accept vulnerability. If you want to pursue something that genuinely calls you, you may eventually have to leave the safety of the path that everyone has already walked. Because sometimes the greatest risk in life is not that something will go wrong. Sometimes the greatest risk is that nothing will ever go wrong because you never did anything that could have gone differently. You can build a life in which you are protected from almost every major form of uncertainty, but in doing so, you may also protect yourself from the possibility of becoming something greater than what you currently are. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.